Good morning to you once again. Thank you so much for choosing Morning at NTV as your kickstarter for dialogue and to enable you have a sneak peek into the day's matters. My name is Priscilla Regina Naloga, and this morning we're going to take note on efforts to end conflict-related sexual violence. Now, June 19th was in 2015 designated as the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, following a resolution by the General Assembly. You do have the day intended to raise awareness of the need to put an end to conflict-related and sexual violence, to honor the victims as well as the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence around the world, but in particular Uganda for this morning, and also to pay tribute to all those who have had courage, devoted their lives to, and even in the course lost their lives in standing up with the eradication of such crimes. Globally, sexual violence has been weaponized as a tactic of war. It's been used as torture, terrorism, and yet due to its nature still remains one of the most silenced and unaddressed crimes. Uganda's post-independence history has been marred by various conflicts that affected most regions of the country, and the longest running and perverse was the two-decade armed conflict between the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, and the Government of Uganda. This morning I'm joined by Marianne Akumu, Program Associate with the International Center for Transitional Justice, to give us more illumination on conflict-based sexual violence, where we stand in Uganda post the conflict that we had in different parts of the country. Focal, of course, is northern Uganda, and what's the future of security for those that are affected. Good morning to you, Marianne.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, Priscilla.
Okay, so let's talk about sexual violence in conflict areas. How is it manifested for us here in Uganda, directly and indirectly?
Thanks for that question, Priscilla. To start off with, as you rightly mentioned, conflict-related sexual violence is a tactic of war that has been used globally in various forms of conflict and across all the different continents. Mm-hmm. We've seen women and girls' bodies used as battlefields, essentially, to fight out these wars. And similarly, in Uganda, as you know, we've had a history that has really been marred by a lot of violence. And throughout all these various conflicts we've had, there have been incidences of sexual violations. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, we don't necessarily have a lot of data and statistics around the levels of sexual violence related to many of these conflicts. But at least the one related to the Lord's Resistance Army, we know that at least 25,000 young women and young girls were abducted and forced into sexual slavery, forced marriage. They were raped. They were forced to bear children. Mm. All this while they were at a very young age. So it is an issue that is very important for us, not just globally, but for Uganda as well.
Did it only affect women and children? How about the men?
Actually,
how about the young boys?
Yes, research has shown that men and boys were also suffered sexual violations. In a previous research that we've undertaken, we had incidences of men saying that, you know, they suffered forced castration, forced nudity, forced mutilation. Mm-hmm. They were also forced to rape women and girls, and all these have had an effect on survivors. But of course, the difference between men and women is that, yes, while there is a larger stigma around conflict-related sexual violence, which makes it difficult to speak about, it's even harder for the men and for the boys because of the patriarchal nature of our society, which, you know, paints men as having to be very strong, and issues of power do not take into account the possibility that it's possible for other men to also rape other men.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now with that having happened many years down the road, I'm sure there's effects and impacts that Uganda still feels today. Yeah. Could you talk to us about some of those?
Absolutely, and one of the most enduring consequences of conflict-related sexual violence is that even decades after it happens, the survivors and the victims still suffer the effect. And we see that here as well. between 2021 and 2022, the International Center for Transitional Justice, the organization I work with, together with the Women's Advocacy Network, which is a network of women survivors of sexual violence, and the Global Survivors Fund, undertook a study to really better understand what the current situation is for survivors of victims, what their issues are, whether they have needs that haven't met. And many of them said they're still suffering, for example, from medical complications. You can imagine for many of these young girls who are forced to bear children at ages of like 11, 12, 13, what that does to the body. They're still dealing with those issues. Many of them have a lot of gynecological issues. Some of them contracted sexually transmitted diseases that, because of the context of the conflict, were never fully treated. So they're still dealing with those effects. Most of the people we spoke to spoke about having psychological issues. As you can imagine, the trauma that they have gone through, not just as a result of the violation, but also as a result of everything they've had to endure through conflict. And unfortunately, those issues have not been dealt with. Now, alongside this, issues of stigma and social rejection when they've tried to reintegrate into their communities have also been prevalent. And those have also had an impact on their ability to form new relationships, their ability to engage in economic activities that can help them support themselves. And for many of the young mothers, they also gave birth to children who are now bearing this burden of being known as children of the rebels. And we've seen that the stigma continues to follow them, both within the family, within the communities, but even in spaces that should be safe spaces for them, like schools. Many of the children reported being stigmatized and discriminated against by teachers who really should be the people providing guidance and support to them. So those really are some of the long-enduring consequences.
Okay, let's talk about solutions that have been developed over the course of time to help in mitigate some of the things that you have mentioned, especially from the place of civil society. How have they come in to actually respond to these issues and sort of help these victims, survivors, and the community by and large to actually resettle into a safe environment?
Well, to start off with, I think it's important to note that the primary responsibility of ensuring the safety and protection of and well-being of citizens rests with the government. And we do acknowledge that government has taken some steps in trying to address this issue. For example, the passing of the National Transitional Justice Policy. That was really an important step because it was a recognition by government that because of our history, we need to have certain mechanisms in place to ensure that we address the past, but also lay a foundation for the future. And we know that government also has implemented several development programs, for example, PRDP and NUSF, specifically targeting those regions that were affected by conflict. However, the general assessment has been that those programs largely focused on the hardware, the infrastructure, and not so much on the people, the humans. They did not do enough to address, for example, those needs I mentioned, the medical needs, the psychosocial support, the issues around stigma and reintegration. And that's where civil society sort of came in to try and complement the work of government. So we've had many organizations, both national, international, local organizations, religious institutions, cultural institutions, doing a lot of work in terms of providing medical care. Some organizations have provided education grants for some of those children that I mentioned. Many of the cultural institutions have done a lot of work in trying to support the reintegration of these individuals into their communities. Religious institutions have really done a lot of work in trying to provide healing and also the aspects of reintegration for many of these survivors. So really it's a situation that requires a multi-pronged, multi-stakeholder approach.
All right, so while civil society in different capacities and hats has been offering this kind of aid that you speak of, what has been the response of the victims? What has been the response of communities, their leaders, in actually embracing what is being offered to them as a way forward?
Communities have been very welcoming of the support that they have received in most instances. I think the biggest challenge that has been faced is that because of the magnitude of the problem, you have an innumerable number of victims, and so not everybody has been able to be reached. And so you can imagine that, you know, if you're within a locality where many of the people suffered and there's only a limited amount of support that only goes to a limited number of people, that can cause issues of resentment and even further discrimination. And that's why we continue to call for a broader government-led program that will be able to reach everyone. I can give an example of, for example, those who are suffering medical issues. We've had many organizations providing specialized surgical support, for example, to women who are suffering from fistula. There are people who still had bullet wounds in their bodies, so there are organizations who've been able to support them to have those extracted. People who lost limbs who've been able to get those kinds of services. But now imagine if those kinds of services were available at nearby, let's say, health centers or at the regional hospital, but at an affordable cost, where issues of transportation, like accessibility, transportation, were also taken into account. That would ensure that everybody who needs that kind of service is able to access it.
Okay. Now, when we talk about rehabilitation, I know that it's not a one-time thing, or 5 months and you're in and out of the conflicted regions. What are some of those steps that are continuous steps or continuous programs that are being adopted to support these victims and survivors of the sexual violence in conflict areas?
I think one of the things that organizations have tried to do is to give survivors the skills to be able to continue some of these enterprises themselves. For example, providing skilling through vocational training, where then once you have the skill, you're able to run your own business, or you're able to have access to resources that allow you to then prioritize your needs. And that's one of the feedback that we get from survivors who say, if we were just provided with some sort of economic support, we would be able to prioritize the things that are most important to us. I'd be able to say, for example, you know, right now the most urgent need is a medical need, so I put the money towards that, and then I know that next I need to take care of education for my children. So I think providing skilling so that these individuals are then not continuously dependent on this aid, which we know is also very limited and, you know, has a time frame.
Okay, so then what can be done to make sure that these kinds of violations do not happen again?
I think one of the things that we need to recognize as a country is that unfortunately we have a pervasive social culture that promotes gender inequalities, and all these are underlying causes of some of these violations that would occur, because we know that whatever happens during conflict is simply a manifestation of what happens during peacetime. So when you have grave inequalities during peacetime, these only get heightened during conflict. I mean, you only have to look at the statistics that are usually released by both the Ministry of Gender and the police around issues of domestic violence, you know, where I don't remember the exact figures, but you know, we have very high rates. You also only have to look at what happened during COVID-19. We had high rates of rape, defilement, underage pregnancies. So once you have that pervasive culture, it's going to only get exacerbated when people have access to guns, you know.
Okay, all right. So why is it very important for Uganda to commemorate this day?
I think it's very important for us because of the kind of history that we have. We know where we've been, we know the impact, but also because we have survivors today who are still living with these violations. And unless we address this, we're going to have a situation where we're going to have dual, you know, a parallel citizenry, where some are able to move forward to develop and live fulfilled lives, and others have been left behind. You know, and so all these ideals that are manifested in our Vision 2040, we're never going to be able to achieve that unless we ensure that we bring along the most vulnerable, that we have targeted programs that address them so that they're able to also participate in the development of this country.
All right, and closing remarks with the International Center of Transitional Justice?
That, you know, we are honored to be able to participate in the commemoration of this day. We think that it is an urgent need that needs to be taken on, especially by the government, to ensure that all our citizens are able to live full lives and contribute meaningfully to the development of this country.
Okay, and just the last one. Have you had any direct engagements with government in regards to what you have said, and what has been their response?
Absolutely. Along with other partners in civil society, we continue to advocate with government for the passing of not only the National Transitional Justice Bill, but other bills that will address some of these inequalities. For example, the Witness Protection Bill that would allow survivors to be able to come forward and give evidence. The Sexual Offences Bill, which also addresses some of these violations. So we continue to have engagements with, for example, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is the mother ministry of the Transitional Justice Bill, the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs that has been also spearheading this process. And we are hopeful that government sees the benefit in ensuring that these legislations are enacted, not just later, but rather today.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Marianne Akumu. And of course, that brings us to the end of the Tech Note. However, this morning we still get to talk about conflict in Kasese, looking at the insecurity there, the disruption. Where do we do the checks, balances, and realignments to make sure that all of Uganda is peaceful and enjoying that stability for all? Of course, Chrissy and you will be back with that conversation with some of the analysts that are going to be shared by the pundits. Do stay with us.